June 6, 1944. For the German military, it began like any other tense day along the Atlantic Wall: cloudy skies, stormy seas, and the looming sense of an inevitable Allied invasion. But there was one critical difference. They didn't think today would be the day. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next, and you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Weather reports, they thought, had bought them more time. What they didn't know was that while they were hunkered down in bunkers and coastal strongholds, the largest invasion fleet in human history was already slicing through the choppy waters of the English Channel. 6,939 ships. Let that number sink in. From the German perspective, the sheer scale of what was heading toward them was almost incomprehensible. Bunkers, minefields, pillboxes, fortifications that had been hyped as Hitler's unbreakable Atlantic Wall were about to be tested not just by infantry, but by an industrialized, multi-domain assault the likes of which the world had never seen. And the results would be devastating. The Germans had prepared. That much is true. Years of labor had gone into constructing the Atlantic Wall: millions of tons of concrete, thousands of miles of wire, mines, and anti-tank obstacles, all designed to stop or at least delay any Allied landing. Hitler believed it would hold. The generals told themselves it had to. But here's the thing. No matter how strong your wall is, it doesn't matter when the enemy brings the whole factory to the battlefield. Before the first Allied soldier even set foot on the beaches, German troops were already being bombarded from sea and sky. The naval guns alone, thousands of them, shook the earth. German defenders, many of them teenagers or middle-aged reservists, were suddenly trapped in bunkers that were cracking apart under sustained fire. Trenches collapsed. Communications lines were severed. Ammunition depots exploded. And worst of all, there was nothing they could do to stop it. The Luftwaffe, the supposed guardians of the skies, were practically absent. Just 319 sorties on D-Day. 2 German aircraft even managed a symbolic strafing run over the beaches, and that was it. Meanwhile, the Allies were flying 14,670 for sorties. The air was completely theirs. German soldiers on the ground looked up and saw the true face of defeat. Wave after wave of Allied bombers, fighters, and transport planes that never seemed to end. And when it did begin, when those landing crafts hit the beaches, the defenders at places like Omaha were facing not just soldiers, but the full weight of Allied industrial might. Supplies, weapons, tanks, and men kept coming, and coming, and coming. German machine gunners burned through their ammunition within hours. Mortars ran dry. Fuel supplies vanished. The Atlantic Wall was never meant to withstand this. What the Germans experienced that day wasn't just a military defeat. It was an ideological collapse. Up until that point, many German soldiers, especially those indoctrinated into the Nazi worldview, believed in their racial superiority, in their tactical brilliance, in the myth of invincibility. But as the waves of men and metal kept landing, as Allied forces crushed their bunkers and outmaneuvered their defenses, the cracks in that belief turned into gaping holes. This wasn't just a fight, it was a revelation. And not a good one. Even more humiliating, the Germans fell for the deception. Operation Titanic, among others, led German forces to believe the invasion might land elsewhere. Fake paratroopers, false radio chatter, inflatable tanks, it all worked. By the time German units realized Normandy was the invasion site, the beaches were already swarming with Allied forces. Strategic confusion turned into paralysis, and that paralysis was deadly. German armored divisions that could have counterattacked were delayed, some due to Hitler's insistence on giving personal orders, others because commanders were simply caught off guard. By the time tanks rolled out, the roads were bombed, bridges were destroyed, and Allied aircraft controlled everything above. The panzer divisions weren't fighting the enemy, they were fighting gravity and fire from the sky. There's something especially devastating about fighting a war where no amount of tactical skill or personal bravery can shift the outcome. That's what many German defenders came to realize on D-Day. Their world, built on myths of dominance and superiority, was disintegrating under the boot of logistical superiority. The Allies weren't just better equipped, they were better prepared, better supplied, and better organized. Germany's reliance on fortifications, on static defenses, on holding the line proved useless in the face of a multi-domain assault coordinated with terrifying precision. By the end of the day, the beaches were Allied territory. The German defenders, those who weren't dead, wounded, or captured, were retreating shell-shocked. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next, and you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Their supplies were gone. Their communication lines shattered. Reinforcements were nowhere to be seen. And worst of all, they now knew that they couldn't win. Not against this. The Luftwaffe had failed. The Atlantic Wall had failed. The command structure had failed. And with every passing hour, the myth of German military invincibility burned a little more. D-Day wasn't just a military turning point, it was a moment of existential reckoning. The battle revealed a brutal truth. In modern warfare, courage alone means nothing. The Germans, who prided themselves on discipline, training, and engineering, were utterly outclassed by an opponent who had mastered the art of industrialized war. The Allies could replace every tank, every plane, every round of ammo in days. Germany? It would take them weeks to produce what the Allies dropped in a single air raid. That disparity wasn't just logistical, it was psychological. German soldiers watched wave after wave of machinery roll onto the beaches. They saw the bombs fall like clockwork. They realized this is what defeat looks like. Not chaos, not collapse, but the cold, unrelenting march of efficiency. From that day on, the Germans weren't just losing a war. They were losing the illusion that they could ever win it. And the lessons of that day still echo. It doesn't matter how tall your wall is, how deep your bunker goes, or how fanatically your soldiers believe in your cause. If you can't produce, supply, and adapt, you're already defeated. D-Day proved it, not in theory, but in the mud, fire, and steel of Normandy. If you found this breakdown eye-opening, hit like, share it with someone who needs a fresh perspective on history, and drop a comment with your thoughts. Was D-Day the moment that sealed the fate of the Third Reich, or was the writing already on the wall? Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the moments that changed everything. It's hard to overstate just how much the events of June 6th cracked the German war machine from the inside out. This wasn't just about physical defeat, it was about psychological unraveling. By all conventional military thinking at the time, the Atlantic Wall should have bought the Germans more time. It was built to resist an invasion, not collapse within hours. From the German side, these fortifications weren't seen as mere obstacles, they were symbolic. Proof that Nazi engineering, discipline, and foresight could withstand anything the Allies threw at them. But as the battles raged and the tide turned, the truth became undeniable. No amount of concrete could protect you from 1,000 ships and skies filled with bombers. It's important to understand the scale of what the German defenders were seeing. The Allies didn't just come ashore, they swarmed it. Every hour, fresh troops. Every wave, more tanks, more supplies, more artillery. German commanders were watching entire sections of coastline vanish under the fire of naval guns that never stopped. They'd built bunkers to withstand shelling, sure, but not this. This was industrial warfare on steroids. And then came the logistics nightmare. German ammunition stocks were never built for this kind of fight. Troops burned through what little they had within the first few hours. Once their mortars and machine guns ran dry, they were essentially sitting ducks. Radio lines had been shredded by air raids. Reinforcements were stalled because the Allies had taken out bridges, trains, and major roads. Some armored divisions sat idle not because they weren't ready to fight, but because they literally couldn't move. That's the cruel irony. The Germans had weapons. They had trained men. They had experience. But they had no way to connect all those pieces once the assault began. The battlefield was cut off, fragmented by Allied air superiority, and suffocated under a logistics chokehold. Every German soldier on the ground was slowly realizing that this wasn't a skirmish they could fight their way out of. It was an industrial vice, closing in. And still, some of them tried. At Omaha Beach, especially, the fighting was brutal. German MG-42s rained down fire on the initial waves of American troops, causing devastating casualties. For a moment, it looked like the defenders might hold. But even then, German officers knew the truth. Their success in inflicting casualties wasn't stopping the invasion. It was slowing it down, barely. Because the Allies never ran out. Not of men, not of tanks, not of planes. The German defenders would destroy one landing craft, only to see 5 more follow it, knock out a Sherman tank, and 2 more would appear. That constant, grinding pressure took its toll. Meanwhile, German high command was still stuck in denial. Field commanders were begging for armor support, air cover, anything. But the response was slow, confused, often contradictory. Hitler himself insisted that several panzer divisions be held back, believing still that the real invasion would come elsewhere. That delay was catastrophic. By the time those divisions were cleared to move, the Allies had already dug in. Defensive lines had been established. Anti-tank positions were set. And of course, Allied aircraft made sure that any German column moving during daylight was a target. Every tank on the road was a sitting duck. It was a collapse in slow motion. And here's something that often gets overlooked: the emotional collapse of the German defenders. Many of these troops had grown up under Nazi indoctrination. They were taught that German superiority, racial, military, cultural, was a given. That their training, their precision, their courage would always win the day. But then D-Day happened, and they saw that courage didn't matter when you were outnumbered, outgunned, and outproduced. They saw tanks and planes churned out by American factories at a pace no German industry could hope to match. They saw logistics so smooth, so relentless, that Allied troops were getting hot meals and fresh ammo faster than German troops could get orders. This wasn't just a defeat. It was an identity crisis. Soldiers who had believed in the Third Reich's promise now faced a battlefield that made those beliefs look laughably outdated. The notion that heroism alone could change the course of a war died in the sand and seawater of Normandy. You could be the bravest man in the world, but what good was bravery when the sky rained fire and your rifle had no bullets? The truth is, the Germans were stuck fighting a 20th century war with a 19th century mindset. Static defenses, rigid command structures, and a belief in the power of the elite soldier, all of it crumbled when faced with flexible, adaptive, mechanized warfare. And the Allies weren't just winning through brute force. Their deception operations were cutting through German intelligence like a hot knife through butter. The fake paratroopers, the misleading radio chatter, the dummy tanks and phantom armies. It wasn't just clever, it was strategic domination. German commanders were chasing ghosts while the real invasion steamrolled them. From the German point of view, D-Day exposed everything they'd gotten wrong. Their trust in the Atlantic Wall, their overconfidence in air defense, their failure to modernize their command structure, their underestimation of Allied logistics, their belief that sheer determination could counterbalance material disadvantage. It all came undone. And after D-Day, the writing was on the wall. German forces would keep fighting for months, but the myth of invincibility had been shattered. Morale plummeted. Confidence in leadership disintegrated. More importantly, the soldiers knew they were no longer in control of the battlefield. They were reacting, not acting. Surviving, not resisting. The defenders of Normandy weren't just defeated, they were overwhelmed. And that's the real legacy of D-Day from the German side. Not just that it was a loss, but that it was inevitable. The outcome wasn't determined on the beaches, it had been sealed in the factories, in the supply depots, in the shipyards months earlier. The invasion was the final act of a plan Germany had no answer for. Because modern war, as D-Day proved, belongs to the side with the better logistics, the deeper supply lines, and the faster production. Bravery is honorable. Tactics are essential. But without industry, without scale, without the ability to sustain a war effort, those things mean nothing. It's no wonder that German troops described a sense of awe and despair as they faced the Allied advance. It was like watching the future swallow the past. The world they'd trained for, the war they thought they were fighting, it was gone. And all that was left was to hold on, for as long as they could, against a tide no bunker could stop. So when people talk about D-Day, it's usually from the side of victory, the triumph, the courage, the liberation. But from the German perspective, it was something darker and more revealing. It was the day they saw that their entire military strategy was built on illusions, that the Reich's promises were hollow, that heroism without supply chains is just a death sentence, and that in the age of industrial war, only one thing truly matters: who can bring more to the battlefield, faster, longer, and in greater numbers. D-Day made that answer crystal clear. In the days and weeks that followed D-Day, German soldiers who survived the initial onslaught were left staring into a new kind of battlefield, one they didn't recognize, one they weren't trained for, and one they couldn't outfight. The old rhythms of war were gone. No more careful offensives, no more waiting for the perfect counterattack. This was survival mode, and the Germans were already behind. Commanders in Normandy reported the same thing again and again. Units scattered, lines broken, morale shaken. Not just because they were being pushed back physically, but because mentally, the war had shifted into something unrecognizable. They weren't just fighting men. They were fighting an entire continent's worth of industrial output delivered with brutal, mechanical precision. One German officer, looking out across the ruined beaches days after the landing, reportedly remarked that it wasn't the enemy's soldiers that scared him, it was the rhythm of the machines. Trucks unloading supplies without pause. Bulldozers reshaping the landscape. Trains and cranes and convoys that never stopped. To him, it looked less like war, and more like a factory had landed in France. That wasn't exaggeration. The Allies had turned warfare into production. While the Germans were still clinging to ideals of tactical brilliance and well-placed defenses, the Allies were measuring success in tonnage and delivery schedules. You want to hold a beach? The Allies will turn that beach into a port. You destroy a tank? 10 more will show up tomorrow. And by this point, the German High Command couldn't even pretend they were in control. Every delay, every miscommunication, every failed counterattack just made it clearer. The Reich had no real plan for this. The entire strategy had rested on the idea that they'd be able to repel the first wave, that they'd throw the Allies back into the sea, declare victory, and stall any further landings. But the first wave wasn't repelled. It broke through. And after that, there was no backup plan. That's why the psychological collapse was so deep. German soldiers weren't just fighting and losing, they were realizing, in real time, that the war effort they'd committed themselves to was built on fantasy. It had no answer for mass production, no counter for air dominance, no path forward. Once the illusion of control shattered, that's the legacy of June 6, 1944 from the German side. Not just defeat, but the exposure of that defeat. The realization that belief, discipline, and training weren't enough. That in this new age of war, the side that could produce more, move faster, and sustain longer, always wins. If this story gave you a new angle on one of history's most famous battles, make sure to like the video, share it with a friend, and let us know what you think in the comments. What shocked you the most about the German perspective? And if you're not already subscribed, now's the time, there's way more where this came from.